The last mile home. The wind came sideways. It came with teeth. February on the high plains, don't ask permission. It takes what it wants. And on this particular evening, it wanted everything. Snow drove horizontal across the flats, thick as cotton batting, turning the world into a white wall that swallowed fence posts, trail markers, and any fool notion a man might have about getting home before dark. Now, David Morrison had ridden through weather that would turn most men around. He'd built the Morrison Ranch from 600 acres of nothing into the finest spread in the territory, and he hadn't done that by running from hard weather. But this Valentine's evening, the sky had other plans. His gelding, Buck, dropped his head against the gale and pushed forward on instinct alone. David couldn't feel his fingers inside his gloves. His eyelashes froze shut between blinks, and each time he pried them open, the world looked exactly the same white, howling, and empty. 4 miles to the ranch house. Might as well have been 40. He thought about what was waiting for him there. 12 rooms, a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, a hired cook who'd have supper warming on the stove, and not a single soul expecting him home. That was the thing about building an empire. You could fill every room with fine furniture and still eat supper alone every night of your life. He was calculating whether to dismount and walk a man generates more heat on foot when Buck stopped dead. Not a stumble, not a shy. The horse planted all 4 hooves and refused. David trusted that horse more than he trusted most bankers. If Buck said stop, there was reason. He squinted into the wall of white. Nothing. Wind screaming past his ears like a locomotive. Then, between gusts, thin as fence wire, a sound that wasn't wind, a woman's voice. David swung down into snow that reached his thighs. He pulled his collar up and walked toward the sound, one hand on Buck's rein, the other stretched ahead into nothing. 30 yards, 40. The shape materialized slow. A wagon tilted hard to the left. Its rear axle snapped clean on frozen ruts. A canvas top shredded by wind, and beneath it, huddled against the broken wheel, a woman. She looked up at him with eyes that held more fight than fear. "Don't come closer," she called out. "Your horse will spook on the axle iron." David stopped. In 20 years on the frontier, he had never heard a woman in mortal danger think first about a stranger's horse. He tied Buck to the intact wheel and knelt beside her. She was wrapped in every blanket she owned, and it wasn't enough. Her face was white as the snow behind her, and her hands were pressed against her swollen belly, fingers spread wide, holding on. "Ma'am," David said quietly, "how long you been out here?" "Since the axle broke. 2 hours, maybe 3. Her jaw was clenched tight. "And before you ask, yes, the baby's coming." A voice in the storm. Elizabeth Hart had buried one husband already. She was not about to let this prairie bury her child. Samuel had been a good man, a decent farmer with gentle hands and a habit of whistling hymns while he worked the plow, same 3 hymns, over and over, until Elizabeth could hear them in her sleep. He'd worked their small homestead until the work took him pneumonia in October. Dead by November, leaving Elizabeth 4 months pregnant with nothing but 60 acres of stubborn dirt and a wagon that was older than their marriage. She'd sold the land for enough to travel. Her sister Martha lived 3 days west. Married to a cattleman with room to spare, Martha had written, "Come, we'll figure it out together." Elizabeth had left at dawn. Timing the journey for mild weather, the weather had other ideas. The contractions had started an hour ago. Too early by 3 weeks. Too fast by any measure. Each one gripped her middle like a fist squeezing wet cloth, and between them she counted seconds, trying to calculate how long she had before this baby decided to arrive in a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere. Then the man appeared. He was tall, broad through the shoulders. His coat was good wool, not the threadbare kind Samuel had worn, patched at the elbow with whatever fabric was cheapest at the general store. His horse was well fed, well shod. Money, Elizabeth thought. This man has money, but that observation lasted half a second before another contraction buckled through her, and she gripped the wheel hard enough to feel splinters through her gloves. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Do I have a choice?" "No, ma'am. I reckon you don't." He looked east, then west, measuring something in his mind. "My ranch is 4 miles east, too far, but there's a line shack 2 miles north. 1 room, but it's got a stove and firewood. Then that's where we're going." He lifted her onto his horse with hands that were surprisingly careful for their size. She noticed that the gentleness. Samuel had been gentle too, but Samuel's gentleness came from softness. This man's came from somewhere else, from choosing to be careful when he didn't have to be. Buck moved through the snow like he understood the stakes. Elizabeth pressed her face against the horse's mane and breathed through another contraction. "What's your name?" she asked between waves. "David. David Morrison." "Elizabeth Hart." She gritted her teeth. "Mr. Morrison, this baby is not going to wait much longer. Then we best not keep him waiting. Mrs. Hart." Cold hearth. The line shack was 12 feet by 10, built from rough-cut pine with a tar paper roof and a cast-iron stove that hadn't seen fire in weeks. David kicked the door open and the cold inside hit him like a second storm still air. Frozen solid, dark as the inside of a boot. He carried Elizabeth to the cot against the far wall. She weighed almost nothing. That worried him more than the contractions. Firewood was stacked beside the stove. God bless whatever cowhand had followed frontier courtesy and left supplies for the next rider. David found matches in a tin on the shelf. He knelt before the cold hearth, struck a match, and held it to the kindling with hands that shook. Not from cold, from what was coming. The flame caught, small at first, uncertain, then growing as it found the dry wood. David fed it carefully, building heat the way you build anything worth having steady, patient, one piece at a time. He'd delivered foals, calves, dozens of lambs in spring when the ewes dropped their young in mud and rain. His hands knew the work. They knew the geometry of birth, the patience it required, the way you had to be firm and gentle in the same motion. But never a human child. Never with a woman looking at him with eyes that trusted him to know what he was doing. He rolled up his sleeves, washed his hands with water from his canteen, laid out the cleanest cloth he could find. "Elizabeth," he said, "I need you to know something. I've delivered more animals than I can count. I've got steady hands, and I ain't gonna leave this room. But I ain't a doctor." She studied his face by firelight. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. "I didn't ask for a doctor. Mr. Morrison, I asked God for help, and he sent a rancher. That'll do." David almost smiled. Almost. "Call me David," he said. "I figure we're past formalities." "David." She breathed through another contraction. Slower this time. Deeper. "We're going to be fine." He didn't believe it, but she did, and that was enough. Born in the storm. The stove glowed red. The line shack walls wept condensation as frozen pine thawed in the rising heat. Outside, the blizzard threw itself against the door like something alive and angry. Inside, two strangers did the oldest work in the world. David talked her through it, his voice low, steady. The same voice he used with frightened mares became Elizabeth's anchor. She gripped his hand through each contraction until his knuckles went white, and he never once pulled away. "You're doing fine," he said. "Strong and steady. That's it." "You sound like you're talking to a horse," she gasped. "Horses and women both appreciate a calm voice in a crisis." "I figure the principle's the same," she laughed. It came out broken and breathless, but it was a laugh, and David held on to it the way a drowning man holds onto a plank, not thinking, just gripping. Then the complications came. The baby was turned wrong shoulder first instead of head. David's stomach dropped, but his hands stayed steady. He'd corrected this 100 times in barn stalls, working by lantern light while wind rattled the walls. The motion was the same. Slow, deliberate, one hand guiding while the other supported. He spoke to Elizabeth the way he'd speak to a laboring mare, constant, calm, never breaking rhythm. She breathed when he told her to breathe. She bore down when he told her to push. And slowly, carefully, he felt the baby turn beneath his fingers. The shoulder shifted, the head aligned, something unlocked. "Elizabeth, one more. Give me everything you've got," she cried out once sharp, high, then bore down with a ferocity that humbled him. The baby came, a boy, slick and purple and furious at the world. David cleared his mouth, turned him over, and the child screamed a sound so raw, so defiantly alive, that it cut through the storm's howl like a church bell through fog. I wish I could tell you the hard part was over. It wasn't. David cut the cord with his ranch knife, sterilized in the stove's flame. He wrapped the infant in his own wool coat, the good one, lined with sheepskin. Worth more than most men's saddles. The baby quieted against the warmth. "Is he?" Elizabeth's voice was a thread. "He's perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs like a church organ." She smiled. Then her eyes fluttered, and David saw the blood, too much of it, spreading beneath her on the thin mattress, dark and steady. Terror hit him so hard it stole the breath from his chest and left nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He laid the baby against Elizabeth's chest and went to work. The longest night. David Morrison had negotiated land deals worth tens of thousands of dollars. He had faced down droughts, market crashes, and a stampede that killed 3 of his best horses. None of it, not one moment, had prepared him for this night. Elizabeth bled. Not fast, not dramatic, but steady in a way that reminded him of a creek slowly overflowing its banks. He applied pressure with folded cloth. He kept her warm. He kept her talking. "Tell me about your ranch," she whispered. So he did. He told her about the eastern pasture where sunrise hit first, painting the grass gold, about the creek that ran year-round, cold enough to make your teeth ache, about the barn he'd built with his own hands the first year, before the money came, when he was just another fool with a dream and a hammer. He talked until his voice went hoarse, and then he talked some more. Around midnight, the baby woke, crying. David lifted the boy with one arm. How light he was, how impossible that something this small contained an entire life, and held him against his chest, while his other hand pressed cloth to Elizabeth's wound. He found himself singing, low and tuneless, something his mother used to hum before she died when he was 7. He didn't remember the words. Just the melody, a lullaby that had survived 30 years of forgetting to surface now, in a one-room shack, at the end of the world, At 2 in the morning, he caught himself praying. David Morrison, who hadn't spoken to God since his parents' funeral, making bargains with the Almighty over a woman he'd met 4 hours ago. Don't take her. Not tonight. Not after what she's already lost. He fed the fire. He changed the cloth. He watched Elizabeth's face for color, any color at all, and found only candle wax white. At 3, she stopped responding to his voice. He said her name. Again. Again. Her eyelids flickered. Still here, she murmured. Just tired. Don't you quit on me, Elizabeth Hart. I did not ride through a blizzard and deliver your son in a line shack just to lose you now. Something in his voice, the rawness of it. The command buried inside the plea reached her. Her eyes opened. She looked at him. Really looked. And what she saw in his face made her reach for his hand. I'm not going anywhere. David, by dawn. The bleeding slowed. Elizabeth slept. David did not. He sat between mother and child, feeding the fire one stick at a time, and looked down at his hands in the amber light. These were the same hands that signed land deeds and shook on cattle deals. He turned them over slowly. They didn't look the same. They looked like they belonged to someone he was only beginning to recognize. David never told Elizabeth how close she came that night. Some truths are too heavy to share. You carry them alone, and they change the shape of your shoulders forever. 72 hours. The blizzard held for 3 days. Elizabeth would remember those days the way you remember a fever in bright, disconnected pieces that surface without warning for the rest of your life. She remembered waking to find David feeding the stove, always feeding the stove, as though the fire were a living thing that required constant devotion. She remembered the smell of broth he'd found tinned beef on the shelf and heated it with melted snow, and the way he held the cup to her lips with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. She remembered her son nursing for the first time. David turning his back to give her privacy. Standing at the frost-covered window with his hands clasped behind him like a soldier at rest. She noticed things. The quality of his boots hand-stitched, oiled, worth a season's wages for a man like Samuel. The pocket watch he checked not for the time, but from habit. The gesture of a man accustomed to schedules and appointments. The way he spoke, measured. Educated, each word chosen and placed like a fence post set in proper ground. This man was wealthy, not comfortable. Wealthy, yet here he was, washing cloths in snowmelt, singing to her newborn at 3 in the morning, that same tuneless lullaby she'd heard through her fever, emptying the chamber pot without comment or complaint. Samuel would have done the same. She knew that with certainty Samuel, with his hymn-whistling and his patched elbows, would have done every bit of it. But Samuel would have done it because he was soft-hearted and couldn't bear to see suffering. David did it because it needed doing. There was a difference. She couldn't name it yet, but she could feel it. On the second day, she asked, "You don't have to do this." David looked up from the fire. Do what? Any of it. The washing, the feeding. You could just keep the fire going and wait for the storm to pass. He looked genuinely confused, as though the question made no sense. As though kindness were so natural to him that separating it from breathing would be like asking a river why it ran downhill. And that right there, that confusion on his face when she thanked him, that's what real character looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up and starts building fires. "I reckon there's no have to about it," he said finally. "There's just what needs doing." On the third night, Elizabeth woke past midnight. The shack was warm, the fire steady. David sat in the only chair, her son cradled in the crook of his arm, both of them asleep. The baby's fist had closed around David's index finger, and even in sleep, David's hand curled protectively around the child. Elizabeth watched them by firelight. Her throat tightened. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth and breathed until the feeling passed, though it didn't pass entirely. She understood that it never would. No amount of money makes a man do this. Only character, only heart. The clearing. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind stopped. David opened the line shack door to a world remade. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean blue so deep it looked like church glass. Snow covered everything in smooth, unbroken white, and the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. He stood in the doorway and breathed air so cold and clean it felt like drinking from a mountain spring. "Is it over?" Elizabeth called from the cot. "It's over." He could ride for help now. His ranch was 4 miles east, less than an hour through fresh snow. He could send men back with a proper wagon, a doctor, warm blankets. Instead, he looked at Elizabeth. She was sitting up for the first time in 3 days, the baby in her arms, color finally returning to her face, pale pink, like the first light before sunrise touches the snow. "I could ride ahead," he said. "Send a wagon back for you. That's sensible. Or you could come with me now. I can rig a travois behind Buck. It won't be comfortable, but it'll be steady." Elizabeth studied him. "Mr. Morrison, David, you've done enough. More than enough. My sister's place is west of here. When the road's clear, you're coming home with me." He said it quiet and final, the way a man speaks when he's already made his decision and the words are just catching up. "You need a proper bed, a doctor, and victuals that ain't tinned beef. My ranch has all 3. She opened her mouth to argue, closed it, nodded. He fashioned the travois from pine poles and the remains of her wagon canvas. Buck accepted the weight without complaint. Good horse, steady as Sunday. David walked beside them through the snow, leading the gelding by hand, checking Elizabeth every few minutes. When the Morrison ranch came into view, Elizabeth's hand tightened on the travois frame. She stopped breathing for a moment, then let it out slow. The main house was 2 stories, white painted, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Beyond it, barns, corrals, bunkhouse, and pasture stretching to the horizon. This wasn't a ranch. This was a kingdom. Men came running, hired hands who stared at their boss walking through hip-deep snow, beside a travois carrying a woman and infant. The foreman reached them first, hat in hand, eyes wide. "Boss, get Doc Whelan from town," David said, "and have Mrs. Clearwater prepare the guest room. Clean sheets, warm water, broth on the stove." Mrs. Clearwater met them at the door. She took one look at Elizabeth, pale, exhausted, clutching a days-old newborn, and her weathered face softened into something fierce and maternal. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. Bring her in right now." The doctor came within the hour, examined Elizabeth and the baby, declared both healthy, if badly exhausted. He pulled David aside in the hallway and spoke low. "That woman lost a dangerous amount of blood. David, by rights, she shouldn't be here. Whatever you did in that line shack." He shook his head. "You did it right." Elizabeth heard none of this. She was lying in clean sheets for the first time in months, her son sleeping in a proper cradle before a stone fireplace that roared with warmth. She looked at the flames and thought of the cold hearth in the line shack, the first uncertain match, the fire David had built with shaking hands. "You saved our lives," she said when he came to check on her. David stood in the doorway. The firelight carved shadows across his face. and Elizabeth saw for the first time how tired he was. 3 days without sleep. 3 days of carrying everything on those broad, quiet shoulders. "I delivered life into this world," he said. "That changes a man. What cannot be undone?" A month passed. February's ice became March's mud, and Elizabeth Hart grew stronger in a house that wasn't hers, loving a man she had no right to love. She helped in the kitchen, tended the garden Mrs. Clearwater was preparing for spring planting, watched from the porch as David worked the ranch directing hands, checking fences, riding out at dawn and returning at dusk with mud on his boots and purpose in his stride. She watched him with her son. That was the worst of it, the best of it. David had fashioned a small cradle from cedar that he kept in his study, and more than once Elizabeth found them there together. David reading aloud from stock reports while the baby slept against his chest. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she knew. She had come to bring David his coffee and stopped in the study doorway. He was holding the boy up in both hands, examining the infant's face with an expression of such unguarded wonder that Elizabeth felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Then David said the baby's name, William, the name Elizabeth had chosen for her father, and he said it the way Samuel used to say grace before meals. Like it was holy, like it mattered more than anything that had ever come out of his mouth. Elizabeth set the coffee on the hall table and walked to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She saw the china cabinet with its English porcelain, hand-painted, the library with leather-bound books by the hundreds, the hired cook, the crystal decanters, the silver-framed photographs of Morrison ancestors in Eastern parlors. Elizabeth Hart owned a second-hand dress, a dead man's wedding ring, and a son born in a line shack. She packed her few belongings on a Tuesday evening, found David on the front porch, watching sunset paint the eastern pasture, gold the pasture he'd described to keep her alive through that longest night. "I need to talk to you," she said. He turned or saw the packed bag. His face changed, but he didn't speak. "I'm a poor widow with a newborn." Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed this. "You're a millionaire. This can't work. David, the town will talk. Your people will judge. And one day you'll look at me across that fine dining table and wonder what in God's name you were thinking." David listened. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for her. When she finished, the silence between them was large enough to hold the whole territory. A meadowlark sang somewhere beyond the fence line. The sunset deepened from gold to copper. Now, what David said next, I want you to hear this carefully, because in my experience, a man's character ain't revealed by what he says when things are easy. It's revealed by what he says when the woman he loves is trying to walk out the door. "Elizabeth," he stepped forward, his hands the same hands that had delivered her son, that had pressed cloth to her wound through the darkest hours of the longest night reached for hers. "I held your hand while you gave birth. I cut your son's umbilical cord. I sang him to sleep while you were too weak to open your eyes." His voice was rough now, not with anger, with truth. "We're bonded, deeper than any courtship could create, deeper than money, deeper than what any gossiping fool in town could understand." He held her hands the way he'd held them in the line shack firm, gentle, certain. "Marry me. Let me be the father he needs." April. Elizabeth's answer was not a word. It was her hand tightening in his, the same grip from the line shack, the same grip from the longest night. They married in April, when the prairie erupted in wildflowers so thick the fields looked like God had spilled his paint box across the territory. The ceremony was small. Doc Whelan, Mrs. Clearwater, the ranch foreman and his wife, a circuit preacher who rode 16 miles to officiate. Elizabeth wore a blue dress David had ordered from Denver, and she carried wild columbine because they were the first flowers William had ever reached for. The preacher asked if anyone objected. Nobody did. Out here, folks understood that love don't follow rules. It follows need and courage, and the willingness to show up when the storm hits and stay until it passes. David placed the ring on Elizabeth's finger with the same steady hands that had delivered her son into the world. The hands that had built fires, pressed bandages, cradled a newborn through fevered nights. Hands that had signed contracts worth thousands, but had never done anything as important as what they did in a 12-by-10 line shack on Valentine's night. Elizabeth learned something that spring, something she carried the rest of her life. That true character is revealed in crisis. Not in what a man owns or what he says at Sunday dinner, but in what he does when the wind is screaming and the fire is dying and someone he's never met needs him to be more than he's ever been. And David discovered that the deepest love forms when two people face death together and choose life. Not the comfortable life, not the sensible life, the brave one. Years on, a boy ran across the Morrison ranch, strong-legged, laughing, brown-haired like his mother with his father's steady hands. He knew his story the way children know the important stories by heart, by firelight, told and retold until it became less a memory than a birthright. Every Valentine's Day, the Morrison family gathered around the great stone hearth. David would settle into his chair. The fire would pop and send sparks climbing toward the chimney. And the boy would lean forward, elbows on his knees, close enough to feel the heat on his face and smell the cedar smoke that, for the rest of his life, would mean the same thing as the word home. David would tell the story of the night the blizzard came, how he found a woman gripping a broken wagon wheel, how she warned him about his horse before she asked for help, how a boy was born screaming into a February gale while the whole world tried to freeze them out. And every year, when David reached the part about the cold hearth catching fire from a single match, the boy would look at the flames roaring in the great fireplace and understand something words couldn't quite hold, that the fire his father lit in that line shack never truly went out. True character is revealed in crisis, and the deepest love forms when two people face the worst night of their lives and choose, together, to believe in morning.